Good afternoon. This is George Yates with another edition of Justice for All. How are you doing out there? We're on K Talk 1650 AM. We've got a show today. We're going to go a couple of hours today with an author named Joshua Horwitz, who is going to be here with us today in the studio talking about his new book called War of the Whales. How you doing, Joshua?
Here, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's this. I'm fascinated by this. Anyone out there listening here today? This book, The War of the Whales, has just been released, and Mr. Horwitz researched this book for 7 years. It's the, I guess, where national security meets marine mammals. Tell us about it, Joshua. How in the world did you get involved in researching and writing this fabulous book? And I'm going to say I did read every word of it from beginning to end. I read all your footnotes.
Oh, terrific.
It's just an amazing. My father's a retired admiral. He's been on my show a couple of times. I've actually talked about your book with him. He says, I think I'm on the whales side. We're in a Navy town, of course, here. Where are you? You're in D.C., right?
I'm in D.C., and I first heard about this story as a newspaper headline it read Whales versus Navy, and it was about a court case that was working its way through the courts, and it kind of read like a divorce proceeding, in terms of the headline, and I delved into it, and there wasn't that much in the newspaper except to say that an environmental attorney had working at Natural Resources Defense Council had sued the Navy over its use of sonar and whale habitats. And I was sort of intrigued by that premise, and I dug deeper, and the deeper I dug, the more I realized that this is really a culture war. The War of the Whales really is a culture war that goes back decades between the Navy culture, which has a very serious mission, as you know, to track dangerous enemy ships in the ocean, particularly submarines, and the culture of save the whale culture, if you will, that has grown up in parallel with this over the past decades. And in the 90s and the 2000s, these two cultures kind of clashed in court. And anyway, so that's the story I decided to tell in this book.
And your main character, Balcom, he has both in his culture. He both had the whale watcher and the Navy background, which was an amazing. You talked about the conflict in his own mind about being a former naval officer and also with knowledge of classified information regarding anti-submarine warfare, and then his 4-decade love affair with whales all over the world, and he became your main character, didn't he?
Well, he was an extraordinary character because he was sort of an ordinary man. If this were going to be a movie, I can imagine him being played by Tom Hanks or sort of an everyman actor, because he had really sort of dwelt in the shadows of even whale research. He had never been academically affiliated, but he had had a very important role as a field researcher, and he had been in this setting. In 2000, there was a mass stranding, and this is sort of the beginning of the book, and the fulcrum of the story is a mass stranding that occurred in the spring of 2000 in the Bahamas, and he happened to have been studying the whales there for the past 10 winters. And it just so happened that the Navy was looking for a new training ground. They had lost their Yates training ground down in Puerto Rico, and they were checking out the Bahamas. And the problem is they hadn't given anybody really any advance warning or done much advanced research, I'm afraid. And so this guy, Ken Balcom, who had both a Navy past, as you mentioned, and a lot of experience, particularly with this species of whales, happened to be there the day these whales, which typically do not strand, started coming ashore.
And these are beaked whales, which many of us don't see. We're here in our area of Virginia. We see a lot of porpoises offshore, of course, and we see whales from time to time. But these beaked whales are pretty special, aren't they?
Yeah, well, there actually are beaked whales off the Atlantic coast, but they're very hard to spot because they have evolved over tens of millions of years to be deep diving hunters, and they happened in the Bahamas. They happen to be resident in the deepest underwater canyon in the world. It's called the Great Bahama Canyon, and it's about 3 times as deep and as wide and long as the Grand Canyon in Arizona. So you can imagine the size of this thing. And they've been living in this canyon. They're a resident community. They've lived in this canyon for tens of millions of years, and they have evolved to be able to dive down. I think 2 miles is almost 2 miles is the record, and they stay underwater for as much as 2 hours between breaths. So these are remarkable animals. I mean, just as a point of reference, a submarine, I think, reaches its, depending on the type of submarine, would reach its crush depth at about 1,200 feet, I think, the deepest diving ones. So these animals go down 10,000 feet. So they're remarkable animals, and they had lived here, and unfortunately there was this really lethal collision between this battle group doing war games in this canyon and these whales.
Your book is incredibly well researched. You get into a lot of the Navy formerly classified information, the anti-submarine stuff. Tell us a little bit about how your research into this got you into all of this classified anti-submarine warfare.
Well, I knew there was a book. You know, one of the things, I'm an author. I'm also a book packager and publisher, and what you're always trying, one of the first questions you're answering at the outset is this a magazine article or a newspaper article, or is it really a book? Meaning, is there really a story here that deserves or can hold up under 350 pages or whatever it takes? And so, when I realized there was definitely a book here, and frankly, there could have been several books. My first draft was almost twice as long as the eventual book.
I was going to say, I know you threw out at least as much as you left in this book.
Yeah, well, it was you got to write the draft you got to write, and then my editor looked at me and said, this is all great stuff, but you're going to have to pare away some because it's we're not going to publish a 700-page book, and I agreed. But in any case, the really rich material, frankly, is the Navy's history with whales,
right, exactly.
And it goes all the way back to the beginning of the Cold War, and it's because the Navy, as you know, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, the Navy has been using sonar, active sonar, since World War I to detect enemy submarines underwater. But they're always looking to improve their technology, and it's back in the 50s and the World War II even, it was pretty crude and short-ranged sonar. And so they found out that bats echolocate in the air, which remarkably was not actually proven until 1941 in a basement laboratory at Harvard University by a biology student. But the Office of Naval Research, which is the big research arm of the Navy, took note of that and started to patronize this scientist's research. And he speculated that if bats, which use sound and sonar, what's called biosonar, to navigate in the air and to hunt in the dark, that perhaps there were other mammals that can also navigate and hunt in the dark that use biosonar. So, and he said, well, perhaps whales. So, no one, we've been hunting whales for thousands of years. There are cave paintings going back 5,000, 10,000 years showing indigenous peoples hunting whales from canoes. But no one had ever figured out that these animals have, particularly the toothed whales, which are not just the beaked whales, but the whales they're called odontocetes, and they have teeth there, including the sperm whales, dolphins, orcas, mostly smaller whales except for the sperm whale. But in any case, these animals have specifically evolved to use sound in really the same way that bats use ultrasonic sound in the air, and the same, which is the model for radar, essentially, even though that's radio waves, the same concept of bouncing sound off of objects. And they had evolved this to hunt in all sorts of environments, not just these deep water environments. And they had done it with just tremendous precision, which the Navy figured out by sending its scientists down to the very first marine park, which was Marine Land, down in St. Augustine, Florida. And in the 50s, they sent a series of when I say their scientists, they weren't even whale scientists yet because the field didn't really exist. So they sent down zoologists, veterinarians, anybody who could sort of test this hypothesis. And over a series of experiments, they were able to confirm that not only do dolphins, which are really just small whales, they're called small cetaceans, not only do they echolocate, but they echolocate with such exquisite precision that they can tell the difference between a ball bearing of 1/16 of an inch and 1/14 of an inch at 100 yards away. They can find objects that are buried in the mud by 6 feet of mud on the bottom of the ocean. They can tell the difference between a zinc plate and a tin plate. They're just remarkable. And so the Navy set about doing two things, and they set about basically the two parallel programs. It was called their Marine Mammal Training and Research Program, or Research and Training Program. And so there was a research arm, which was basically looking at all of their properties and seeing how they might reverse engineer that technology into their own sonar technology. And then on the other hand, they were also training these animals to work in combat situations. And this was mostly classified in the 60s. Once they realized that the Russians had their own dolphin program, which was based in the Crimea, they went totally dark, the U.S. Navy, and had decades of classified research and training, where they were training them to patrol harbors in Vietnam, to sweep minefields, because these animals can tell the difference between a decoy mine and a real mine. Anyway, they've had a long-term investment in these animals, and now that it's become a declassified program, or at least this part of it is, they are now deploying these same dolphins, these militarized dolphins, or whatever you want to call them, in the Persian Gulf, and have since 1988. So,
and we're continuing to use them, right, for swimmers in the water, to protect our ships. I know you have a part in your book about the Cole, which is a destroyer assigned to Norfolk. When the Cole was damaged, it was towed back here to Norfolk area. And after that, we've used dolphins in the water to protect against this sort of thing. Is that still going on now, to your knowledge?
Yeah, it is. I mean, they use it sort of as needed. They're about, and again, the numbers change from year to year, but there are about 100 Navy dolphins, but also they have trained seals, they have beluga whales that are mostly kept in San Diego, and on an as-needed basis, they air transport them to the Gulf and use them to, again, patrol against enemy swimmers or objects, anything, minefields, the whole gamut. And the reason they're doing that, I mean, the Navy's gotten a lot of heat from animal rights groups and whatnot, because, it's not a natural environment, obviously, for a dolphin. Anytime you send an animal into it to sweep a minefield, you bring them in harm's way. And so certain people don't like this idea, and the Navy would much rather work with mechanized versions of this, and they've been working for decades to develop essentially what would be a dolphin drone. And they have developed these. They're called AUVs, or autonomous underwater vehicles, and they are the closest the Navy's been able to come to simulating what they do. And they have side-scan sonar, and they have cameras, and they're about the size of a dolphin. In fact, there's one of these is what's scanning the South Indian Ocean, still looking for the Malaysian 370 airliner. That's a direct descendant of these dolphin drones. But the fact of the matter is, those mechanized dolphins, if you will, only work in particular like flat bottom environment where there's no turbulence in the water, where everything's very controlled. If you imagine a swimming pool or a tank, they do just fine. But if you put them in a real world situation where there's all sorts of stuff going on in the water and on the ocean floor, they really don't do very well. So that's why they keep bringing these dolphins back, because they are really expert at this.
We're here on K-Talk 1650 AM. I'm George Yates. Show is Justice for All, and we're talking with the author Joshua Horwitz regarding his new book, War of the Whales. Briefly summarize, and we'll get back to a lot of the details, because I want to ask you about some of these incredible characters that you write about in your book. There's enough material in your book, as I say, to do a radio show on just this oceanographer, Monk.
I'll tell you, he's the one guy I'm tempted to write a book about. I mean, with all these things, if I had to write another book, he would be the subject.
I mean, the dude's sitting down with somebody over a martini with a cocktail napkin, and he's designing this system to basically determine whether or not the global warming is happening in the oceans, and he does it on the back of a napkin at the Cosmos Club in D.C. Or this fellow John Lilly. Now, they made a whole movie about him, right?
They've made two movies about him, actually, but he's a total character.
So I'd like to get back to talk about Monk and Lilly and Balcom, and of course the lawyer hero of your book is a fellow named Joel Reynolds.
That's correct.
An environmental lawyer crusader from California. But tell us a little bit about, now, the book was, at one point it did become the whales versus the Navy. lay out basically the plot, if you will, of how the Wales versus the Navy kind of from Balcom right up until it ultimately ended up in the United States Supreme Court, didn't it?
Okay, well, I'm going to set it all up. I'd rather not give away the climax, because I'd love some of your listeners to feel like they need to read the book.
Okay, all right.
But
all right.
I'm happy to set it all up because, in fact, there are ongoing cases. I mean, I just do want to say that all of the issues that are covered in this book, and the book actually goes all the way up until the very recent past, until essentially the present. But even since the book went to press, there have been other developments. So this is an ongoing story, and the climax of this book is the Supreme Court case, probably. But so what happened was you had this attorney who was not a scientist by any means, but he was an environmental attorney who certainly relied on expert scientific evidence and expert scientific witnesses to make his cases, which are essentially endangered species cases on land. He ran the Los Angeles office of the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC. His name is Joel Reynolds, and he stumbled on evidence all the way back in 1994, 20 years ago. He stumbled on evidence of well, getting too technical, I mean, really a super sonar system. It's called low-frequency active sonar system that the Navy had developed during the Cold War, specifically to track Soviet submarines over the horizon, meaning at great distance. And your father was a surface admiral? Was he a surface ship admiral?
Well, he was an aviator, but he also commanded several surface ships, an aircraft carrier, John F. Kennedy, from here. So he had a lot. He also
planes were very involved in this too. There's a very elaborate system of queuing, and it was a multi-platform system. But and they would always, once they'd identify where a submarine was, they would dispatch P-3s and other planes to go, use magnometers and various ways to pinpoint where these submarines were. But what they mostly needed back in 1988. 87, 88, there was a big spy trial where someone had given away sold our silent submarine secrets, or quieting secrets technology to the Russians, and the Russians and this has happened all the way back in the 70s, but over the course of the decade, the Soviet submarines went silent, so to speak, and it made it impossible to hear them with passive sonar. So there's a kind of sonar called passive sonar, which is a very sophisticated listening network of microphones. Basically, the Navy wiretapped the oceans in the 50s and 60s and had succeeded in keeping it pretty much secret. It's called SOSUS, and Balcom, my Navy character, had actually been a SOSUS operator in his day, but to do that he had to learn all about marine acoustics. In any case, in the 80s, near the end of the Cold War, though they didn't know it was the end of the Cold War, the Navy realized that they would no longer going to be able to hear Soviet submarines at distance just by listening. So they had to develop more powerful, longer distance active sonar systems. So what they came up with is something called low-frequency active sonar. And one of the characters in my book, Dick Pittenger, was really the godfather or the father of this program, along with Walter Munk, who was one of the contributors to the science. But in any case, the concept was you can use low-frequency sound waves, which travel a lot farther in the ocean. And if you crank it up enough, have a high enough decibel level and long enough waves, you can flood whole ocean basins with sound and essentially light up the whole ocean. So if you think of it almost like a sonogram of the ocean. And, if you've ever seen a sonogram of a pregnant woman, that's something 3 feet by 2 feet area of you're using sound to illuminate the amniotic fluid in the womb. Well, if you take that and extrapolate that to the oceans, that's really what they were doing, and they were basically. It was a very high intensity system, and on paper it was a good idea. So you could light up the whole ocean, you could see every object in the ocean, and then you could extrapolate that with information you had about where Soviet submarines might be, and use other technologies to pinpoint them, and you could track them around the oceans. The only problem was that whales, particularly large baleen whales, which also operate at low frequency in terms of their own communication and navigation, they use that same bandwidth to communicate and to survive. And so this created a real problem. The Navy, unfortunately, during the Cold War, which ended in over a period of about a year, 1889 to 1990, there was the Soviet Empire kind of collapsed, and the Soviet Navy was the first thing to pretty much be mothballed. But prior to that, they were a terrifying enemy, and there were hundreds of Soviet submarines, both hunter-killer submarines and boomers with intercontinental ballistic missiles, which the Navy was feverish to track for good reason. And so, but they had never applied for permits as they are required by law. There was a series of laws, most significantly the Marine Mammal Protection Act, passed in 1972, which requires anyone who is conducting activities that may harm or harass marine mammals needs to get a waiver, essentially, from the Fisheries Department, National Marine Fisheries Service, inside NOAA. And so, certain activities are allowed. This could include geological surveys that use sound, oil and gas exploration, scientific research, anything that's going to put sound in the ocean, which is known to disturb animals, marine mammals. You need, or anything else, underwater explosions. You have to get a permit. Well, the Navy had never bothered to do this, and so when Joel Reynolds in 1994, about 4 years after the end of the Cold War, stumbled on evidence of this low-frequency active system, it caught his attention, and it came out in a sort of a inadvertent way, and so he decided to investigate, and we'll find out what is this system. And it was a secret system that nobody knew about except the scientists who had worked on it. And anyway, over a course of time, he was able to piece together enough information to confront the Navy about it and say, wait a minute, you should be permitting this. And they said, what permits and what Marine Mammal Commission? And so it was an education process on their side, and it was also a negotiation because they didn't really want an environmental attorney telling them how to operate, and not to mention publicizing what were still secret sonar systems.
Now, this was litigation that he got involved in on the West Coast.
Yeah, well, it started in the West Coast. He had initially sued the Navy over what are called ship shock tests, where they shock the integrity of a hull of a ship before it's deployed by dropping 10,000-pound bombs in the ocean nearby.
And they wanted to do that off the coast of San Diego, right?
Right. Well, they wanted to do it right on the edge of the Santa Barbara Island Marine Sanctuary. So he challenged that successfully in court, and then very soon after that, somebody came to him about this. And he got, these sound experiments the Navy was doing that Monk had devised. In any case, he stumbled on this. He went after the Navy, but the problem is he hadn't sued them over this because he didn't really have enough scientific evidence. There wasn't enough information about the system. There wasn't enough information about its impact on whales. There were just concerns expressed by scientists, and you can't go to court with concerns. You have to go with an evidence trail. So he spent the next 5 years trying to be essentially like a Paul Revere, but a civilian. I mean, he was not a scientist, but he was going around to science conferences around the world trying to rally scientific opinion and attention to this issue. And he said, listen, you guys should be looking at this. There are lots of observations made by your colleagues that there might be some connection. And they were saying, well, if there were a connection, we'd have seen it. But this really highlights one of the fundamental conflicts in the book. And to me, this is the single most interesting. I don't know what interested you. It's a delight to be talking to someone who's actually read it, because most people haven't had a chance to read it yet. But as you may have seen, the most interesting through line, or consistent one, is the scientists, because before the Navy got involved in researching whales and dolphins, there was no marine mammal research, much less whale research. The only people who cared about whales back in the 40s and 50s were whalers, who were desperately trying to revive these crashed whale stocks that they had wildly overfished for decades. So the Navy was starting from scratch and trying to figure out, what are these animals? What can they do? Which ones can we work with? They tested all sorts of animals and sort of focused in the end.
And it's interesting that the battle became the whales versus the Navy, but really the Navy was one of the first to start really showing interest in whales and the science behind them. We're going to need to go to a quick break here.
Okay, sure.
And we'll be right back with Justice for All and the War of the Whales, and we'll be right back. Thank you.
Locations in Chesapeake and Portsmouth is your dedicated Tire Stars dealer. At Finks, their experienced staff specializes in brakes, steering, suspension, tune-ups, oil changes, and much more. They also handle rebuilt engines and transmissions, and they're your destination for tires, rims, and towing as well. Finks is located at 2236 South Military Highway at 2711 Victory Boulevard. For more information, log on to finkscarcare.com or call 545-3573.
Nor'easter season is here, so don't get all wet. Protect your house. Call Crawl Space Door Systems at 363-0005. Reduce your flood insurance, reduce the threat of mold and insects, and save energy. Crawl Space Doors, air vents, flood vents, vent covers, and fans can help you stay dry or get you dry quickly. Contact Crawl Space Doors for more information at 363-0005 or online at crawlspacedores.com. Stay dry, my friends.
WHKT is on Facebook and Twitter. Like us on Facebook, WHKT AM 1650. Follow us on Twitter at WHKT AM 1650 and stay in touch with K-Talk 1650.
Hi, we're back on K-Talk 1650 AM. I'm George Yates. We're with author Joshua Horwitz, who's just written this incredible book, War of the Whales. We've been discussing it the last 30 minutes. We're going to keep going here with Mr. Horwitz. In the last 30 minutes, we were talking about, and I wanted to, a lot of us that didn't know some of this incredible, that you talked about a lot about the Cold War, and how, and the Walker spy ring, which you talk about, John and Art Walker, who it's famous around here, of course. They're the most famous spies in this area. I think one of them just died in prison. As a matter of fact, just read about him just the other day. And you talk about how for the longest time we had a classified edge over the Russians, that the Navy is the most secret of the services, and that so much of this technology, so much of this capability that we had to track submarines was so classified that only very few people even knew about it. And that's what enabled us really to keep an edge over the Russians all through the Cold War, yet nobody knew about it until the Walkers apparently gave all our secrets away to the Russians, and we had to go to a new type of program. Tell us a little bit about that. Your book really does get into that, so it's a fascinating read for people that are interested in that sort of thing.
Well, there's some interesting angles regarding whales also in that story, because what they were doing, first they started back in the 50s. I believe Bermuda was the first listening station where they tested this theory, and it had a lot to do with something called the Deep Sound Channel, which a geophysicist named Maurice Ewing discovered. It was a hypothesis-based discovery where he hypothesized that there's a layer in the ocean. Okay, the ocean is obviously all sorts of gradients of temperature and pressure as you go up and down and in different environments. However, he said that at a certain level there is a combination of temperature and pressure where sound will not disperse in the water but will continue to propagate almost without diminution. So if you make a noise in the ocean, a sound in the ocean, those sound waves go out and they disperse in all directions and they dissipate pretty quickly. But if the sound goes down and becomes trapped, if you will, in this layer called the Deep Sound Channel, which is about 3,000 miles down, it will just continue on and on and on and on. So that's a sort of remarkable concept. If you're the Navy and want to be listening in on Soviet submarines beyond the horizon across the whole ocean basin, what could be better than to tap into this listening chamber, if you will? And anyway, there was a great story in the book, about how he actually demonstrated this, dropping hand grenades into it and having a ship listening and keep going out and out and out until he couldn't go any farther, and they were
He was
still
asking
hearing
people
it.
to fly over the ocean and drop grenades into the ocean.
Well, that was just, first he did it in Bermudas and said, oh, my God, I can go hundreds of miles. Then he wanted to see if he could go across the ocean. He had some guy going on a Matt's plane and dropping grenades through the toilet, which is the only way to drop them, that were time fused to detonate at 3,000 feet below the ocean floor. And he had a listening post out in the Bermudas, listening as the plane went went east and all the way to Dakar, Africa, basically the entire Atlantic Ocean. He could hear this. So this was an astounding concept for the Navy to grapple with and say, okay, what can we do with this? And what they decided to do was to place hydrophones, essentially microphones, out in the ocean and connect them to the shore, starting in the Caribbean and going all the way up the eastern seaboard, all the way up to the Greenland Gap, and basically they by the mid '60s they had wiretapped both coasts. And other places basically they created an acoustic net around the country all the way out to Midway. So Ken Balcom at one point was in charge of the Midway station for sonar, the passive listening, which is the Horwitz station out in the halfway across the Pacific, and he was connected to all these other hydrophones out there, and they could hear. And so here's where it gets really interesting to me. So, okay, you can hear what's going on in the ocean. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on in the ocean. It's not just noisy Soviet submarines. It's all sorts of, underground volcanoes erupting and weather, thunderstorms and lightning strikes on the surface, and not to mention what they call biologicals, which is everything from fish to snapping shrimp to, of course, whales and other marine mammals. And so when they stuck these microphones in the ocean and started listening, they heard this kind of cacophony of sound. I mean, we have this illusion that the oceans are silent, that they're somehow, because when we maybe go snorkeling, it feels quiet down there. But in fact, it's quite noisy. And so the challenge became, how do you filter all the sound signals you're getting? How do you identify which are the Soviet subs and what's not? And so there are a couple of characters up at Woods Hole Oceanographic, which was kind of a sleepy oceanographic society until World War II, when the Navy started pumping a lot of research money into it. And they sent out these guys, Watkins and Cheville, and one was a zoologist and one was a linguist. And they basically, this is how so they had to basically figure out which were the biologicals. That was their job. Go identify all the sounds that all the creatures in the sea are making and identify them so that when we hear those, we'll know that's not a Soviet submarine, that's an X, Y, and Z. And anyway, so in brief, the way they did this is they put a microphone in the water, and they were traveling the whole world eventually doing this. They put a microphone in the water, they'd hear a sound, they'd go towards the sound, they'd kill whatever it was, however they could, bring it back, skin it, send the skeleton back to Cheville's museum, which was the Harvard Zoological Museum, where they would compare it to the bones they had there on display and say, oh, that's such and such kind of whale, or that's such and such kind of seal, and then they would then match that recording to that species, and they created this catalog. So part of what a SOSUS operator like Balcom did when he was listening and making these audiographs of these different noises in the ocean, he was listening and saying, okay, that's a biological, no, that's not a biological, maybe that's a submarine, and then they had a whole catalog of Soviet submarines and what their sound signatures were. So you had this incredible system of sound. So the Navy, you can tell I get kind of carried away with these stories, but the Navy not only created the whole scientific discipline of marine mammalogy and whale science, but they also created marine acoustics. It didn't really exist as a discipline. So all the great, acousticians who were trained and developed and doing research through these decades, including Walter Munk, were all Navy-funded scientists. And
so this was what you call passive sonar.
Right.
And this passive sonar, this deep ocean, deep sound channel, and you've got these hydrophones. Now, people are actually listening then on headphones 24/7, trying to discern. And were they able to track Soviet submarines then using this method, so we knew where they were at all times?
They were able to track Soviet submarines. They were able to identify where they were. They were able to locate them or target them, as you say. In terms of tracking, that's when they would start pinpoint. So again, you're talking about an object that might be 1,000 miles away. So you need multiple points. You need a bistatic system where you can triangulate to do that. But and of course, it's a moving object. So what they would typically do is that they would, for instance, they'd say there's something out there. We think it's a Soviet submarine. We think it's this class. Then they would dispatch planes, either from a land base or from an aircraft carrier, to go and drop sonobuoys, which are sort of short-range listening devices in the area, and they get a better fix on it, and they could get a much better, clearer signal there. And because long range has problems, long range listening is always a little problematic. And then they would fix it, and once they fixed it, they would put a submarine on it to track that submarine. So if they found a boomer that they wanted to track, they would get one of our hunter-killer submarines to just follow that submarine around the world. So, you can imagine this chess game.
Were the Russians aware? Now, the Russians didn't have this system.
Well, the Russians, okay, again, the science stories, I'm a science writer, I'm not a scientist, but I learned so much researching this, and I've made my best attempts to explain it in lay terms in the book. But one of the interesting little things is that at the same time we discovered the Deep Sound Channel, virtually the same time, there was a Russian scientist who had also discovered the Deep Sound Channel using explosive experiments in Russia, off the coast of Russia, so the Soviet Union. So they did know about the Deep Sound Channel, and they had a very primitive, localized system. I think in the Northwest Pacific, but. That was very local, and we knew, I think, where it was. What distinguished ours is that we really, it was a huge private-public kind of collaboration. We had Bell Labs, all these telephone companies, basically, were contracted to lay cable, because there's a lot of cable involved, because the microphones had to be put out in the Deep Sound Channel, often on seamounts, which are mountains in the bottom of the ocean, out, halfway across the Atlantic, and they were connected by cable to listening stations on the shore. So it's just, as you can imagine, this is a very, it's sort of like the coaxial cables, or I'm sorry, that's the wrong kind of cable. They're the kind of cables now that carry all of the data back and forth on, our contemporary media needs. But in those days,
fiber optics,
sorry, thank you. And
right.
So those are crisscrossing the ocean, but at the time these were more primitive kind of telephone cables. But it was a big operation. That's what's so amazing. They kept it secret because it was a very elaborate network of listening stations.
Well, and you mentioned in the book, of course, that the Navy is so classified. They've got this group called the Jasons. I was fascinated by them. There's so many.
That's another great book. I would love to
another
write that
book, The Jasons. The Jasons you talk about is this elite group of scientists. Tell us about the Jasons.
Well, the Jasons actually grew. We're sort of a descendant. Most people know about the Manhattan Project, which was, the scientists who were brought together to crack the code of nuclear fission and create the first atom bomb. And it was not just in Los Alamos. There were pieces of this research that were spread across hundreds of campuses, academic institutions around the country. I think there were 10,000 scientists involved in various places. And then at the end of the war, they all went back to their academic posts, and that was that. And so the Navy said, wait a minute, we need to try to hold on to some of this brain trust. And so they started something called the Office of Naval Research, which I'm embarrassed to say I think I've heard of but knew nothing about before I wrote this book. And the Office of Naval Research is probably the biggest research institution in the world. I don't know how their budget compares to NIH. I know ONR, the Office of Naval Research, has about a $3 billion budget. And some of that's in Navy labs, like the Naval Research Lab here in Washington, D.C., and other labs around the country. But they also fund research by academics all over the world, certainly all over the country. So they came up with something called the Jasons, and it wasn't the Navy, I'm sorry, that came up with it, but it was the Defense Department trying to reclaim some of the intellectual capital they lost when the Manhattan Project ended, and it was really in response to Sputnik, which was 1957, I believe, when the Russians launched, the Soviets launched Sputnik. Suddenly there was this missile gap and this recognition that we were actually falling behind the Russians on all sorts of technological levels that had military applications. So a group of physicists were brought together. Initially they were all physicists, and there weren't a lot of them. There was a very elite group of a couple of dozen physicists, and they were sort of self-governed. It started at Princeton, I think, was the genesis of it, but they drew from all the major physics labs in the country, and they basically spent their summer. They had summer sessions, and they were called the Jasons. They were sort of wanted to be like Jason and the Argonauts. I think it was their grandiose idea. In any case, they basically solved problems for the military. And initially it wasn't the Navy. The Navy, Monk was the first Navy guy. He was in 61. He was the first non-physicist. He was a geofluid physicist, oceanographer type, but these guys were all atomic physicist types. In any case, they would spend a summer session, like summer school, and they did it in La Jolla, and they would hang out together, and the generals and the admirals would come and say, we have this problem, and they would ponder the problem and come up with proposed solutions. And Walter Monk was the first Navy guy there, and he had what was called the Jason Navy eventually, which is, the Navy was so secret that even inside this super secret organization where the names of the people who were members have never been published anywhere, there's only sort of rumors of who, and some people have outed themselves, if you will, but it's so secretive. But inside this secret organization was the Jason Navy, where people who worked on the Navy projects weren't allowed to talk to the other physicists about the problem. Only, you had to have these vows of silence within this cone of silence. So, the Navy is the most secretive arm of the service, and it's particularly submarine and anti-submarine warfare for good reasons. It's a stealth operation, and so they had good reasons to want to keep things private. But anyway, the Jasons continue to work to this day. Walter Monk was the first. I met Walter Monk up in Woods Hole, where he was doing some summer study, and he's based out at Scripps. He lives in La Jolla in California, and in any case, he started working for the Jasons in 1961, I believe, and he was still working with them in the age of 93. The last time I saw him, in fact, there was I believe a 50th would have been, I think a 50th anniversary, totally quiet. There wasn't any publicity. It wasn't in the newspapers, but there was
It's too secret for them to even have a party announcement.
Well, it was a reunion, and he told me that the CIA director came to address them and express his appreciation because it had to be private. But anyway, that's just one of the subplots in this book.
Well, yeah, like I said, this book could spawn any number of, and you've already got Tom Hanks playing the movie role. I got it. It's already. Have you?
Leo
anybody talked to you
DiCaprio
about
could
the
do
movie?
it. There are any number of people if they're listening today. It could be anybody. Brad Pitt. I could see any number of people.
Well, listen, any cool, adventurous sort of character, because Balcom is definitely a guy who spent his whole life out on the water and definitely sacrificed. He certainly, he was even eating roadkill for a while so that he could do this orca survey up in the Pacific Northwest. So
right.
He's a pretty fascinating character. Listen, well, we're going to try to, we're going to actually do a couple of hours today, but just the 1 hour is going to be the live part today. And
okay. Well, you want me to bring the story up to date a little bit from the history?
Exactly. What I wanted you to do is, from what I get now from this, is the Walker spy scandal blew the lid off, because the passive sonar doesn't cause harm to mammals.
Right.
It's a listening thing. And of course they could hear these blue whales from 1,500 miles away underwater.
Yep.
So they did learn a lot about whales just from this passive. But you're saying your book says that after the Walker spy scandal, the Navy had to come up with this active sonar, which this LFA you call it, and that did harm to whales, or at least what is whales versus the Navy, and how did that spawn litigation? And without getting into the details of how the book ends,
sure.
But let's lay out the legal battle and how all that laid out.
So again, Reynolds since 1994 had been on kind of had heard about this system that was hatched during the Cold War, but the Navy, being the Navy, didn't want to relinquish this technology, even though it wasn't clear yet who the next over-the-horizon enemy might be. They wanted to deploy it. They hadn't yet even deployed it, but they've been testing it for almost 10 years by 1994 without permits. So in any case, Joel Reynolds confronted them. The Navy agreed to start applying for permits for LFA, which they were now planning to deploy around the globe. They basically ended up applying for 98% of the world's oceans as a territory where they could deploy this without any mitigations or any restrictions. And Reynolds really didn't have any grounds to go to court. There were no precedents for this, and he didn't have a physical evidence trail showing harm caused by this. There were just suspicions and rumors and concerns. And then, really largely due to the fact that he was going around alerting marine scientists, they started to notice when there was an atypical mass stranding of whales, because some kinds of whales strand not infrequently, but these beaked whales, for instance, almost never strand alive, So when there were mass strandings, they started to look on the horizon, and lo and behold, there would often or not infrequently be a battle group on the horizon, a NATO group or something. So But they still had no evidence trail. 1996, there was a major stranding in Greece during NATO exercises, and there was a forensic veterinarian who descended on the scene and took some specimens, but it was about 2 days after they had hit the beach, and that's a long time for a dead whale to be on the beach. They start to deteriorate almost immediately. So there were still just nagging concerns and rumors and that kind of thing. So anyway, then 2000, there's this mass stranding in the Bahamas, and it becomes apparent pretty quickly. I mean, Balcom's on the scene. He spends the first day trying to push these whales, which are not enormous whales as whales go. Think of them as very, very, very large dolphins. They sort of look like dolphins, but they're much bigger. And they maybe are 20 feet long and 6 or 8 tons. And so he and his volunteer partners or associates, spent the first day pushing these whales back out into the ocean, hopefully that they would make it safely back to the deep underwater canyon, but there were a lot of sharks in between. But he knew that there were going to be dead whales on the beach by the next day, and he went up he also was trained as a Navy pilot, so he went up in a plane and surveyed for specimens, and sure enough, he found plenty of specimens. He also sighted some Navy destroyers in Northwest Providence Channel, which is where this happened. And so he photographed everything, he videotaped everything, including the initial strandings. He then had the presence of mind to do 2 things that were critical. One is he called the person at the Office of Naval Research who ran the Marine Mammal Division, who he had gone to graduate school with 30 years earlier at University of California, Santa Cruz, a guy named Bob Gisner, and together they came up with a plan. He said, listen, Bob, you guys, meaning the fleet, are you guys doing something down here? There's some operations going on down here. And Gisner said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And then they said, and Balcom said, listen, I need help. I'm one guy down here. I need your support to collect some specimens. And they agreed that the best thing to do was just cut off the heads and drag them into a deep freeze, which is what they did. He cut off the heads of these whales, a couple of the most freshly preserved specimens, and put them in a bait locker at a local cafe where he had a friend who ran it. And that was really the beginning of an evidence trail that eventually led to this series of lawsuits, because as soon as Joel Reynolds heard about it, he realized the potential for having finally something he could go to court with. And Balcom initially, the interesting part of the story for me is Balcom did not race into the arms of the environmentalists. He was working with the Navy on the investigation, and he wanted to be part of this investigation because the Navy was sending down the world's best bioacoustics people and forensic pathologists, and they were putting their A-team on this because the Navy, to its credit, really wanted to know what had happened. The Navy always, as you may know, if something goes wrong at sea, they have a very thorough investigation. They have an after report, and the Navy doesn't want to repeat mistakes. They want to figure out what went wrong and fix it.
But Balcom didn't like the Navy's response at first, and Balcom actually was on 60 Minutes and was asked whether or not he thought the Navy was responsible, and he said, what did he say?
Well, he said, I think the Navy did it. And the reason he agreed to go on, 60 Minutes knew that he had videotaped the whole event, and they wanted to come down the next day. And
a lot of people were upset with him.
Well, the fact is, he didn't want to go that route. What he wanted to do was be part of a transparent Navy investigation that would be publicly published, once there were findings, et cetera. And what happened was they needed him to bring the heads. There's all this paperwork about bringing marine mammal parts into the United States. And so he basically transported these frozen mammal whale heads all the way from Abaco Island to Miami to Boston to a Harvard CT scan lab so that they could be properly scanned and then later dissected. And he realized as soon as he handed off these heads to the Navy investigators, and as soon as he signed over the chain of custody papers to them, that he was expendable to them, and they treated him that way. He was just a gadfly. He was an annoyance at that point. They didn't want him around. And that's when he realized that the Navy, while it was probably intent on finding out what happened, was going to do everything they could to keep that information from public disclosure, because that's just the Navy's way, or up to that point, that had been their pattern. So that's when he agreed to go to a press conference here at the press club, DC Press Club here, National Press Club in Washington. He invited the 60 Minutes people to come down, and yes, they could use his videotape, and yes, he would be interviewed. And he became a reluctant whistleblower. He really was reluctant, though. It was not his style historically, and not what he was hoping would happen. But that's what happened.
Your book is very good. I know that your main characters, of course, are on the side of the whales. Joel Reynolds and Ken Balcom. But you do a good job, I think, in the book of talking about how important it is for the Navy, number one, to maintain a lot of its secrets and classified information, and also the need for them to have a program that's going to keep us safe, because there's a lot of danger in the world. Tell us how that was when you were trying to write this book, and we've only just got a few minutes left in this hour, but I think it's important that we see that. Did you ever feel like you were kind of taking a side, whales versus Navy? It seemed like in the book you tried to be as representative of both sides as possible.
Well, again, the representations in the press of the lawsuit and the problem have been mostly whales versus Navy, or the environmentalists versus the Navy. But really, what I discovered, knowing very little about either side, particularly about the Navy — I knew nothing about the Navy, but I got to know a lot about the Navy — is that these are both groups. The Navy and the environmentalists are both groups that care deeply about the ocean and about whales, but for very different reasons. And it really was a culture clash, because they had a clash of missions. And the mission of the Navy is to first protect the homeland, and secondarily to protect its sailors and ships. And they certainly have no malice towards the whales, despite having trained them to sweep mines and stuff. That's debatable what that constitutes. But in terms of these mass strandings, they didn't want whales washing up on beaches. Aside from the terrible PR, they don't want to. They want to be good stewards of the ocean, but they also feel they need to train. This is all, by the way, about training, not battlefield operations. And so the environmentalists are saying, please don't train in known whale habitats. And they're saying, well, we need to train where we're going to be fighting in the same kind of environment. So that was a clash. And I have nothing but respect for all of the I had great retired admirals who really educated me about not just national security threats, but about how sonar works, which is quite complex. I came away convinced that you do need to train, and you can't do it all on simulators for this kind of combat. But ultimately, it's the Navy's problem. I mean, they are creating this problem, and they do have to address it and fix it, and I think they've taken a lot of steps towards doing that. But unfortunately, there continue to be incidents. There was a mass stranding in Crete just a few months ago during U.S. Navy, Greek, and Israeli Navy exercises. And so, the problem isn't solved, but I think the more dialogue there is, the more open discussion about the problem and possible solutions, the better for everybody. And so hopefully it doesn't have to be just in the courtroom, an adversarial proceeding.
You say that it's an ongoing thing. We've just got a couple of minutes, and then before we'll go to our next segment, which people can get online. And then later I'm going to do a rebroadcast, and down the road we'll do a rebroadcast so we can hear the whole show in its entirety. But when you say it's ongoing, have the Navy and the environmental groups gotten together as a result of this sort of? Is there enlightenment on both sides now? And
compared to where the Navy was operating 20 years ago, where they weren't applying for permits, they were operating totally in the dark. Now they have come under the tent, the permitting tent, and the arguments are to some degree around the edges, like, okay, what kind of geographic and seasonal exclusions can we institute and whatnot. And there's a lot of back and forth and push and pull, and it's still in the courts, unfortunately. And despite the Supreme Court ruling in 2008, NRDC is back in court against the Navy in California and Hawaii over their latest rounds of permits that fisheries just issued them for explosives and sonar trainings. And so, I don't personally think the solution is the ultimate solution has to be people on both sides, reasonable people sitting down and coming up with workable compromises, is my personal feeling. It's probably not going to get solved in the courts in some total way.
Well, it's a balancing act, and that's what your book really discusses. And this concludes our first hour with Joshua Horwitz regarding his book, War of the Whales. We're going to come back not on live, but online, and then later in the rebroadcast. So, and in our next hour, we're going to discuss a lot of these other characters in his book, which actually would be subjects for a whole nother book. John Lilly, this fellow Monk, and some more of the scientific investigations that have gone into Mr. Holcomb's book. So we'd like to thank you for being with us, Josh.
It's been a pleasure. I appreciate your good questions and close reading of the book. It's been great.
and we'll be back next week from 2 to 3 on. Actually, we're going to go to a 2-hour format next week for Justice for All from 1 to 3. We'll look to see you next week, and everybody have a great afternoon. This is George Yates with Justice for All. Okay, we're back with our second hour with Joshua Horwitz, who's the author of War of the Whales, and it's been a great first hour. And I was just, while we were offline, I was just talking with Mr. Horwitz about his travels in the course of writing this book. Where does this book take place? It's all over the world, isn't it, Josh?
Well, I was fortunate. My first trip, as soon as I got my book contract, I needed to do a quick study on whale science, so I went to the Biennial Marine Mammalogy Society meeting, which that year was in Cape Town, South Africa, and I got to hang out for a couple of weeks with all the leading whale scientists, and just did a cram course. But the other amazing thing about that place is it's where the Indian and South Atlantic Oceans come together, and it turns out that's not just a line on a map. It's actually two different ocean ecosystems that converge, and there's this huge upwelling of marine life, and there are sharks, and there are every kind of whale and other kind of marine life there, and it's just a spectacular setting. So that was where I got my feet wet. And I subsequently went to the Bahamas, to Baja, to Hawaii, to the Pacific Northwest, to Woods Hole, to La Jolla, and Scripps, to Point Loma. So both coastlines up and down, and even Texas A&M, the least likely place you can imagine. But there were some. They have some retired Navy folks who have been active in this area in College Station in the middle of Texas. So I even went there to interview them. No whales there. But
This is 1650 AM. I'm George Yates. The show is Justice for All. This is the book is War of the Whales. It's on sale. And my engineer, when I walked in this morning, my engineer said, "I think I've seen that book over at Barnes and Noble." So, we need to get it before they make a movie out of it. And it really would be a great movie because of all the great locations. The orcas, I have a question about the orcas of the Pacific Northwest. I remember seeing them there out in Penn Cove when I was a kid in high school there. So they've been around for many, many years. But you don't hear about orcas in other parts of the world. Where is it? Where are the other killer whales? They're not here on the East Coast. I don't recall them talking about them a lot in Baja or even in Hawaii. They must be all over the world. Why is it just the Pacific Northwest as we see these orca populations?
Well, there's one reason is that it's a good question. My understanding is that they are ubiquitous species. Their killer whales are in all sorts of oceans. They are the top predator in the ocean. They even have been seen to attack great white sharks. So they're everywhere. But where we see there is a large resident, or not so large anymore, resident population. There's what's called the northern resident and southern resident that more or less correspond with the Canadian-American border up in Greater Puget Sound. And Kim Balcom has been up there surveying this population of orcas since 1976 because Penn Cove was the site of a rather notorious orca capture, because this is where I think the reason we associate them so much with the Pacific Northwest, other than the fact that they're very visible there and they are resident rather than transient there, or resident much of the year, is that that's where the orcas were first captured for captivity.
Namu.
The Vancouver Aquarium, again, accidentally captured. They wanted a stat. They didn't think you could keep one in captivity, so they commissioned a sculptor to go kill a orca and bring it back and use it as a model for a sculpture he was going to use. Except he failed to kill the whale. He only injured it, and they had to end up dragging it back all the way to the aquarium, and they were amazed that it recovered, and they then were amazed to find out that it was not this ferocious beast, but in the presence of humans, anyhow, it was quite gentle and playful. Orcas are actually in the dolphin family. They're the largest dolphins, or delphinids, and So they were trainable and quite social. And so other aquariums, then the Seattle Aquarium went out and captured one, and then SeaWorld wanted them, and so people went out and started capturing them in the wild through rather extreme measures to capture them because they're not easy to capture, and a lot died in the course of capturing it. So by the mid-1970s, basically, there had been enough egregious incidents where they were using seal bombs and inadvertently killing whales and trying to hide that fact that it was banned in those waters. But then they proceeded to go, when I say they, SeaWorld went and collected the wild orcas from Iceland, became their next hunting ground. So there are, in fact, orcas all over the world. They just are concentrated in certain areas like the Northwest. There
have been any mass strandings of orcas?
Well, there was an incident in 2004. I mean, what was remarkable is that Balcom, again, one of these things that is like too strange to be true, but is true. So Balcom happened to be at ground zero for this mass stranding in 2000, and 4 years later, after the first big lawsuit, NRDC won its first big lawsuit against the Navy in 2003, and 6 months later, Balcom was back up in his summer survey ground there, right on the shores of the Harrow Strait, which is a strait that basically runs between Canada and the United States. And he was surveying. He was up on his deck with his telephoto lens, and he has hydrophones underneath to listen to the whales. In any case, the USS Shoup, which is a destroyer based in Bremerton, Washington, somehow hadn't gotten the memo about not doing high-intensity, mid-frequency sonar exercises in enclosed, straits and whatnot. And anyway, he videotaped that, and there's if you go to my website at warofthewhales.com, you can find a link to that videotape, and it's also cited in my book. You can find the URL. But in any case, he was able to record this very high-intensity sonar exercise going on right, a mile from a pod of orcas, which are frantically milling in circles in the foreground, and there's also a boat of whale watchers who are freaking out because it's clear that something terrible is going on. Those orcas did not strand, however. About 7 pilot whales did strand nearby, and pretty clearly in response to this sonar exercises. So orcas do not seem to strand in the presence of sonar, though, I should say stranding is what's known as a lethal consequence of sonar and other sound pollution in the ocean, but it's not the only one. And there are lots of non-lethal behavioral responses in terms of habitat abandonment.
When Balcom, when these beaked whales stranded in the Bahamas, he continued to survey there for some time, although I know that he and his girlfriend, a researcher at the time, seemed to break up not long after that. Mm-hmm. It appeared that he did not go back to the Bahamas after that, but she continued, I guess, to do research there. Is it true that the beaked whales never returned to that area?
Well, they have been some sightings of beaked whales there in subsequent years. I think nobody knows exactly what happened. They don't know how many ended up dead at the bottom of this 4-mile canyon. But I think none came back initially, and then over the next few years, some of them returned, were seen again, some that had been identified there previously. So I think what's likely to have happened is that they scattered. I mean, it was a traumatic enough experience for these whales that they didn't feel safe in that canyon, I think. And so I think what happened is that many of them dispersed to other canyons or other waters, and then gradually started to trickle back. But the majority of the ones that they did catalog and record during those 10 years have not returned or not been seen again. So I'm afraid a lot of them just either ended up at the bottom of the canyon, or because for them to flee this deep underwater canyon for the shallows, which is a pretty desperate move considering they never leave the canyon, it means they have to traverse this gauntlet of sharks. If you've been to the Bahamas, you probably know about the sharks there too, and it's not a safe place for an orca.
There's a great phrase throughout your book, which I have yet to say once, but we have to say it right. A deaf whale is a dead whale. Isn't that what you say several times in your book?
And I didn't coin that. There was a woman named Lindy Wildgard, who's a marine biologist, who came up with that phrase. And what that means is that the thing you have to understand about whales, and the reason they became such expert echolocators in the first place, is that they evolved in the dark. These are animals who live, particularly the deep diving whales, but the ocean is a very dark place below the first 100 meters. And so even in the Bahamas, where the waters are crystal clear, if you get on 100 feet or 100 meters rather, it's a perpetual midnight. So if you're hunting and navigating in those waters, you learn how to use sound, and that's what they did. So these are acoustically very, very sensitive animals, and that's why they're so sensitive to sound.
Your book talks about how they've kind of co-evolved with squid. Tell us about that.
That's an amazing thing. I mean, again, there's been one of the enduring ironies of the story is that 95, I don't know, most of what we know about whales derives directly from Navy-funded research, and initially most of that was sort of self-interested research, meaning what the Navy wanted to know about how they could deploy these animals in military situations. But subsequent to these lawsuits, there has been a lot of Navy funding going into looking at their response to sound. I mean, the Navy would love to prevent, these strandings from continuing, and they're looking for ways to, workarounds, I think. So one of the things that they've just been able to do is tag these whales and see their dive patterns, even though they're operating in the dark. So they have wonderful 3D recreations of how these animals hunt at depth. And one of the things that they've been able to piece together from the archaeological record is that they basically found their own niche. Okay, so if you have everybody's foraging all this marine life from sharks down to small fish, or are foraging in the upper levels of the water near the reef, where there's lots of animals and lots of food and also lots of light. And so these animals apparently evolved to be able to first echolocate in the dark, whether it's at night or at depth, by being able to see the hard shells on a nautiloid, like a shelled animal. And then the squid, over time, shed their shells to become harder to find. And then the beaked whales then, in turn, evolved much more sophisticated echolocation, which could see these non-shelled animals, and then the squid developed jet propulsion to get away from them, and squid clouds, and it's a total cat and mouse is a mixed metaphor here, but you can imagine this kind of minuet of evolution that took tens of millions of years to evolve. But they do hunt at depth, and so you have sperm whales, by the way, which are much bigger, also hunt at depth, and they hunt giant squid. They basically have the giant squid to themselves.
Well, it's this fellow. This fellow Jim Mead, did you get a chance? He's at the Smithsonian, right?
Yeah, he's a terrific guy, a terrific character. I mean, really, this is just such a feast for a writer, because what you want as a writer is to find, real-life characters who you couldn't make up, if you tried, and people who undergo change and transformation, because that's what makes a drama, right? So all of these people who I had met had been fundamentally changed on both sides, including several Navy researchers, had been transformed by their close encounters with whales or dolphins. And so Jim Mead is just one of those, but he was a kid. He grew up in the Pacific Northwest. His father was a logger, and he was he was horrified at the prospect of becoming a logger himself, and he ran away. He applied to Yale University and magically got in. He went there on a scholarship, and he became a biologist and a geologist and a zoologist, and he's a brilliant guy. And he ended up running the Smithsonian's marine mammal. He became the curator of mammals, actually, at the Smithsonian, with a specialty in marine mammals. And he basically pulled together their huge collection of bones and body parts, and really curated that collection. And he also went out and collected stranded animals and really started the first stranding network up and down the eastern coast anyway. And so he had been studying this possible problem about sonar and mass strandings of whales all through the 90s, and he had been kind of doing it the way academics do it. They compile data, and they look at meta-analysis, and they, go all the way back. And so he'd been noodling around with this, and he happened to be a friend of Ken Balcom's, a friend because Ken Balcom had gotten him through his first sea voyage in a memorably named place called Dildo, Newfoundland. They had set out on an old whale during the last days of the whaling in Canada to chart whales, not to kill them, but to survey them. And he had been seasick for days. Balcom bailed him out and brought him trash cans to throw up in and saltines. And anyway, so they were kind of forged in that kind of bond. And then, so, decades later, when Balcom, who was just stepping out into the limelight after really dwelling in the shadows of field research for decades, suddenly had the glare of this publicity. He was on 60 Minutes, which was at the time one of the most watched shows in the country. And he was at the press club, at press conferences, and he was a fish out of water. He was not comfortable at all in this environment, and the Navy was going after him. I mean, really not in a institutional way, but individually, the people were smearing him, and what happens to whistleblowers in that situation. And so Jim Meade decided to reach out and throw him a little lifeline, not by doing anything other than publishing the research he had been digging through for the last decade, and instead of going through a long peer review process, he published it under the Smithsonian letterhead and just pushed it out into the community and said, look, there is a connection. I've looked at every mass stranding, atypical mass stranding going back 40 years, and there's a clear correlation here. And so when Jim Meade said that, who was an unassailable expert, the expert in his field, it was a lot harder for the Navy to say, this is foolishness, this is just some guy with an axe to burn, or whatever they were saying about Balcom.
Yeah, that was sort of the definitive statement when that came out, because he was so nonpartisan.
Yeah, well, he was typical. I mean, this is the drama. This is the spine of the book, in my mind. It's really become sort of a battle for the heart and soul of the science community, because these scientists are like other scientists. They love science. They're not political fundamentally. They certainly don't like legal battles. They don't want to be in a courtroom testifying against their colleagues, or certainly testifying against the Navy, which is more likely than not, giving them grants to do research.
Well, that's the thing that's a little troubling about it. And I know you mentioned it, and I know you don't want to disparage any of these scientists, but what do you suppose the fact that ONR funds much of this research? You can't help but be a little bit biased. Doesn't that hurt some of these scientists' credibility when one side or the other is paying paying for their research?
Well, certainly the potential for a conflict, there is a potential conflict of interest, which is ubiquitous. I mean, there's just no doubt about it.
Right.
And I don't know, we're talking about your father in the Navy. My father was a neurosurgeon, and what he once told me when I was a kid and didn't really understand what he was talking about, he said the most important quality in a neurosurgeon, I thought he was going to say his hands or his judgment, he says, is his integrity. And I didn't really understand what that meant until I got to be an adult. And I realized in every field, I'm sure they must exist in your field too, there are always conflicts of interest, potential ones, where you have, somebody, your professional interests are over here and your moral interests might lie, somewhere else. And so these scientists were staring down the barrel of that, and they were, and some of them, as in any group of people, some acted well, and some in my mind acted poorly, which is to say, they followed their paymaster rather than where the evidence was pointing them. And that's my judgment. I can't prove that. But I think, I was able in one instance to get a really inside look. There were two people who had worked together throughout their young, careers, and one of them was being lured away by the Navy with a big research program that was related to this issue, but the Navy was sponsoring it, and he had been on the other side up to then, but suddenly, they were offering him 5 years of heavily, the best financed research program ever, and by the other one in the middle of the night and said, I don't know what to do. And the guy he was calling worked in Canada, where he didn't have to raise his own money. He said, listen, I understand the situation and do what you need to do. But, you can see this laid out very vividly. And it doesn't mean that if the Navy is paying you, you're changing your conclusions, but it does make you beholden to them. I'll give you one example. When the Navy came out of the Cold War, and they needed to justify their enormous Cold War budget, and one of the ways they did this is come up with dual use, civilian and military uses for technology. So SOSUS, which was this very elaborate, expensive underwater listening station, they wanted to keep that active, even though there were no Soviet subs to listen to. Who knew? Maybe the Chinese, somebody would be out there they want to listen in on. So one of the things they did is they opened it up to civilian research, which is, listen in and follow whales, not just submarines. the fact is, they only gave 2 civilian researchers access. One of them was Bill Watkins, who was one of their initial guys who went out, capturing and skinning and recording those days. And he went back to the 60s, and he was an old man by then, frankly. And the other one is a guy named Chris Clark, who's really a brilliant guy, and I think, did it because he wanted access to this incredible technology, and he got it. But he was also, working with the Navy on this low-frequency active program, and nobody really knew about that at the time. And as it turns out, the Navy let him listen in on this system, but they let him publish very little. And if you're a scientist, if you can't publish your research, it's agony. So he was doing all this research, but because it's inside this still classified system, the Navy didn't want him publishing any locations, any decibel levels, any frequencies, it's that kind of thing. So, you make these devil's bargains, and I think they're all doing it in pursuit of science. Nobody's getting rich, nobody's getting powerful. This is all about science, but it's who controls the purse strings is often, very important.
Yeah, well, my degree is in marine biology, and then I have a law degree. So your book sort of, the two kind of.
You're my perfect reader.
Yeah. So that's why I said it was right up my alley, because I went to college up in the Pacific Northwest, and then I've spent a lot of time in the Bahamas. So I started reading your book, and I said, this guy, Ken Balcom, I'm going, oh, this would have been the guy I would have been if I hadn't gone to law school. I got a kick out of the fact that he almost went to law school, and he said, no, I think I'm going to go research, whales down in the Bahamas. I said, you're my kind of guy. Yeah. That's not
and then
bad.
You got to see Joel Reynolds, who went the legal route, and
exactly.
what he did with it.
But listen, your characters. I have to ask you more about this fellow Lilly. We haven't gotten to him yet.
Yeah.
Some of those experiments. I don't know how much of that you left on the cutting room floor of Lilly. Looks like you did a lot of research. You had quite a bit on your book about John Lilly, and what a fascinating character! Really, the first real dolphin researcher, and he made these predictions that we would be talking with dolphins or extraterrestrials within a decade or two. Some of his predictions didn't come true, but he wrote that book, Man and Dolphin. And tell us more about John Lilly that is in your book, and might not even be in your book.
Well, I mean, what's remarkable is that he really is, as much as anything, he embodies the sort of braided narrative of the story, because he was a brilliant neurologist. Again, there were no whale scientists. He was a neurologist in the 50s. He worked at NIH, which is around the corner from where I live here in Washington, D.C., and he did the first cortical maps of macaque monkeys. And my father, who was a neurosurgeon doing research at the time, actually crossed paths with him. But in any case, he was really one of the leading neuroscientists of his time, and it was early days in neurology. They were just figuring out where the pleasure and pain centers are in the brain. And macaque monkeys actually have very small brains compared to ours. And he kind of spent some years mapping that brain, and then he heard about these really big-brained mammals down in marine land that the Navy was looking at. And in fact, dolphins have brains that are virtually the same weight as ours, and the same size in proportion to their bodies as ours, and that, was considered significant. They're very convoluted. They have large frontal cortexes. So he went down there and started studying them. I should say, you mentioned there was a movie made from Lilly. There are actually 2 movies based on his life. One was called Altered States with Jim Hurt, and it was about a scientist who creates the first isolation tank, which he did in the 50s. He created these suspended isolation tanks where you float in a saline solution in the dark, and he was already experimenting with the idea of altered spaces and leaving your body. So he had a kind of mystical side to him from the beginning, but he was a very buttoned-up scientist.
And the LSD.
Well, that came later. So he at the time he went down there to study these animals. He ended up unfortunately killing several dolphins down in Marineland because he couldn't figure out how to anesthetize them without drowning them.
Right.
So he eventually came back a couple of years later, and with a technique he had devised, he could basically put electrodes in their brain without anesthetizing them. And anyway, he started probing into their auditory cortex, and a dolphin has a much bigger auditory cortex than we do. It's much more developed. I mean, dolphins can do things. I mean, they've subsequently shown that dolphins can communicate. They can carry on a half dozen conversations simultaneously. I mean, you and I are talking to someone in a crowded room in a restaurant or a cocktail party. We have to filter out all the other noise to focus in on this conversation. But dolphins, as you can imagine, this can actually conduct simultaneous conversations across different distances and different pods. I mean, it's wild.
How in the world can they determine that? I'm fascinated by.
Well, this is what decades of Navy-funded research has shown. So Lilly was the first one there, and he probed into their, and they also make a lot of noise. They phonate, they make chirps and barks and whistles and all these sounds that nobody knows what they're saying. So he started probing in that part of the brain, and he thought that he heard them communicating with him. He thought they were imitating his voice and laughing, and he fell in love with these animals. And he went and talked to the American Psychiatric Association annual meeting about this, and how this is, again, right in the Sputnik era, and he was saying, our first interspecies communication isn't going to be with aliens in outer space. They're going to be with animals like this. They're living right here among us. And we need to learn how to communicate with them, because these are sentient beings. These are big brain. I mean, these are like chimpanzees. They have big brains. They don't have opposable thumbs, so they've created a totally different culture than we do. But they clearly are doing a lot of things we don't understand. So here's what's interesting about Lilly to me. He simultaneously went to the Navy and consulted with them and suggested to them that these were animals that could echolocate, were highly trainable, and that perhaps we could train them to do things like clear mines and patrol harbors and whatnot, and even more devious things that may or may not have been followed up on in terms of planting explosives on enemy ships and whatnot. And then he also said we can learn a lot about underwater communication from these animals, potentially how to communicate with them directly, but certainly how to communicate better in the ocean, which the Navy is also very interested in. As you probably know, if you're communicating with your submarines or between submarines, or listening in on communications underwater, this is critical stuff, right? You got to figure out how to communicate without being heard, how to eavesdrop on other communications. So they were intrigued by this. So they funded so while the Navy went about training and researching these animals in Point Mugu and Point Lomo and in Hawaii, they also funded his Cetacean Research Institute, Communications Research Institute, CRI, which was in the Caribbean. And he went there and basically, this was in the 60s, and at the time LSD was a legal substance, and it was particularly used in research. It wasn't legal to sell on the street per se, but it was not yet banned, and it was certainly used rather extensively and had been since the 50s in all sorts of neurology research. So one of the things he's got interested in is dosing his dolphins with LSD. He had taken LSD himself at the time. He had been involved in the movie Flipper. Because he was the dolphin guy. He'd written this book called Man and Dolphin, which became a bestseller. And so he was a producer on Flipper, and he and the wife of the producer of Flipper turned him on to LSD, and he liked it. And so he started dosing his dolphins with LSD. He started dosing himself at the same time as his dolphins. He was kind of going off the deep end, and the irony of this is that his colleagues had looked to him as a real pioneer, and he was an important guy in their fledgling field a few years earlier, and suddenly he's publishing stuff not in the peer-reviewed literature, but in the media about how we're going to be carrying on active conversations very soon with these animals, and he came up with all sorts of, he had a famous experiment where he wanted to co-rear or co-inhabit a human being and a dolphin in an aquatic space over a period of time and see what happens. So he recruited this very attractive young research assistant named Margaret Howe and a dolphin he named Peter, and so Peter and Margaret lived in this pool together for months, and he encouraged all sorts of interactions between them which are kind of lurid, but the point being that he's kind of going off the deep end, and as soon as LSD got involved, it went deeper. So by 1968, he had decided these animals had more to teach us than we could teach them, and that they shouldn't be in captive settings. He liberated his dolphins. He retired to Esalen and subsequently Hawaii, and became a real New Age figure. But in doing so, he really helped ignite this whole Save the Whales movement. He was the first person who said, wait a minute, these aren't just casks of floating oil that we should hunt, or they're not just animals we should train to entertain us in a marine park. These are sentient beings who have important messages to teach us, and we should be revering them. and that was really the beginning of the whole Save the Whales movement.
And now,
so,
is Lily still around?
Lily died in 2001, I believe, in Hawaii. But he was very active as an author. I don't know how old you are. You were talking about, different age, what you were doing in the 60s, 70s. I was in college in the early 70s, and I was reading John Lilly's books then because he was the first guy who wrote books about the brain as a biocomputer. I mean, that's sort of a cliche now, but at the time, no one had really talked about the human brain that way. And I remember reading books. I was a humanities student back in the early 70s, and that's one of the books we were reading. So,
well, he was
an important figure.
Yeah, and I was in college in the 70s too, and I see a guy like Lilly, and the fact that he was doing these kinds of experiments, and it's a kind of, and then you say he became off to be this new age kind of a guru type character, and then he's a fascinating character. Have there been any documentary films or anything?
Well,
made
there was
about
another.
Lilly
No, there was
himself?
another film made called Day of the Dolphin, which was clearly based on his. So there's Altered Spaces, which is the sort of trippy side, and then there was another one with George C. Scott. Mike Nichols directed it, and it was a sort of fictionalized account of this whale scientist who had CIA and Navy money to do this whale research. And anyway, the bad guys come in and try to commandeer his dolphins and use them for all sorts of nasty, nefarious things. So that was sort of loosely based on his career down there. There hasn't been a real documentary on him, but if you're interested in John Lilly, there's not a lot in print, but he wrote lots of books, including some autobiographies, where he talks a lot about his own transformation from a buttoned-up scientist to an astral metaphysics guy. And
I wonder how much all the LSD had to do with that.
Well, unfortunately, he didn't really stop with LSD. He was also got involved in a drug called ketamine, which also actually has some therapeutic uses, but it's a very strong hallucinogenic drug.
Well, for the longest time, people thought LSD did too. Maybe it still does. Maybe in certain doses. Listen, we're with Joshua Horwitz, the author of War of the Whales. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes. I've got some other interesting characters. This is a great book, War of the Whales. Sure to be a movie with Tom Hanks soon, but we'll be right back with War of the Whales. Okay, we're back with Justice for All. I'm George Yates, and we're here with the last 30 minutes of our interview with Joshua Horwitz, who's just released his great book called War of the Whales. And if you love the Navy, then you'll love this book. And if you love the marine environment and whales and dolphins and the porpoises that are off our coast and you want to know more about them, this book is fascinating. It's one of the best research books I've ever read. And you do a really incredible job here, Josh, of not only footnoting it with your sources. You lay out who the players are, and it's really great. And it's you. I want to, before we get into, I want to talk about Walter Monk and also about some of the Navy people, the admirals that you interviewed. But when you first got into this book, did you attend the Supreme Court hearing on it?
Yeah, I got involved in this book before, a full year before the Supreme Court case in 2008. So I was able to be there, not just on site for the court case itself, but for what they call these moot courts, where they would rehearse with different law professors playing different judges in a recreation in advance, sort of like they do for presidential debates.
Yeah.
So it was fascinating to see how attorneys prepare for those cases.
Yeah, because this show, of course, Justice for All, and I'm an attorney, and I often interview lawyers and trial lawyers, and you covered that part of this book, the actual hearing before the Supreme Court. Without getting into the details or what happened in the case, so that people will read the book, what did you think about our Supreme Court and the way they handled this? Well,
the Supreme Court is a unique setting, an institution, in that it's the highest court in the land. There is no appeal beyond them, and so they're they're the 9 most powerful judges in the land, needless to say, and yet they're human beings. So it was fascinating watching the preparation for this case. There was, I was watching, during the preparation phase, I was mostly hanging out with the environmental team. Subsequently, I was able to interview the Navy's legal team. But at the time, I was there while they were, doing their own war room, and they were trying to figure out, which justices to focus on and who the swing judges were. And one of the wild cards was Stevens, because Stevens, who was very elderly at the time, this is shortly before he retired, was the only one in the entire court who had ever served in the military. And he had served in the Navy during World War II. So there was some concern there, even though he was one of the more liberal judges. He was considered on the left side of the court. He was a wild card. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that, they're individuals in the end.
Well, and it's a great result ending with the way that the Supreme Court decision came down, and it was without getting into it, it did allow for a little bit of room on both sides of. I guess both sides could declare victory a little bit, depending on your point of view. So I think that was great the way that it ultimately came out. Although the exact details you have to read the book to see. Let's talk about a couple of the more interesting characters. The most fascinating character in the book outside of Lily was this fellow Monk. Is it Walter Monk?
Walter Monk is how you pronounce it in Austria, where he's from.
And you met him.
Oh, I gotta say, I hung out with a lot of really smart, interesting people, but he was a standout. People throw around the word genius pretty loosely these days. Anybody who makes a good commercial is a genius, right? But this guy is in my lifetime, and I'm almost 60. He's the only person I would ever call a genius, and I'm not the only one to call him that, of course. But it is a special opportunity to spend time with someone like that. And it was almost ironic that I got to meet him at all, because, again, without getting into the too many details about the history, but he had been. Well, let me tell you who he was, and then why he had been so hard to get to for so many years for writers and journalists. He emigrated from Austria in the 30s, not initially because of the war, though he was a half Jewish, half Quaker family. His family was a banking family in Vienna, and they were trying to groom him for the family business, and he was something of a playboy. He liked to play tennis, he loved to ski. And so they sent him to New York, where they had a relative or a relation in a bank there to essentially train him and get him on the straight and narrow. And anyway, he got there. He hated banking. He ran away to California, literally. Got in a car and drove out west. This would have been in the late 30s, and he went to Caltech, which is California Technology. It's the MIT of the West Coast, if you will. And he became a geophysicist, or that's where he first went, and then he got involved in geophysics, fluid physics, and oceanography, and there really wasn't much of a discipline in terms of academics, but he went up to a famous guy up at Scripps and basically told him he wanted to be his graduate student. He was his only graduate student. Anyway, he was this clearly brilliant young guy exploring the Pacific Ocean and having the time of his life. And then the Anschluss happened. This is in Germany in 1938, if I'm not getting it wrong, or maybe 1940. The Austria and reclaimed Austria, and he was so shocked by that event that he dropped out of graduate school at Scripps, and he joined the army. And I don't think he was even a citizen at the time, but he joined the army, and he was training with the ski brigade up in the Northwest to go join, for whenever we got into the war, he wanted to go fight the Nazis in the Alps. And in fact, after Pearl Harbor, he was recalled to Scripps because all of the oceanographers were being recruited into the war effort. So his contribution to the war effort, and he was a very young man at the time, he was in his early 20s, and his distinct contribution is just mind-blowing. But they were already planning the amphibious invasions of North Africa and subsequently, Italy and all the way up the coast. But North Africa was the first place they were going to be doing these, and they were having problems with the training exercises, which they were doing, I think, off the coast of North Carolina, because these amphibious boats on high seas, they would get swamped, and sailors were drowning, and, it was terrible. The infantry, rather, were drowning, or the Marines, I guess they were. So he said, I think I might be able to help you out. And he basically was charged with predicting the tides and the surf levels in Africa on certain dates, and he was doing this from a bunker inside underneath the Pentagon. So he was basically using a slide rule, his mind, and a chalkboard, and figuring out when the safe times, meaning when the tides, waves wouldn't be so high that they'd be swamping these little amphibious vehicles. When the windows were, and he was able to become the guy who could accurately predict this. So he basically forecast when they should do the landings in North Africa, all the way up Italy, and then finally at D-Day. And D-Day was, of course, the big one because the Germans knew they were coming, but they didn't know where and they didn't know when. And he was able to accurately forecast a 12-hour window in a big sea storm on the night before D-Day, or that became the night before D-Day, and they had enough confidence in him based on his prior experience at this point that's when Eisenhower said go, and the tides were high enough to carry them over those big. If you've seen Saving Private Ryan or anything like it,
right.
They had those huge steel barricades in the low surf, and so the surf was high enough to get over them, but not so high that they would swamp. And he in no small part was responsible for the success of D-Day, and never got credit for it until much later. I mean, it was not publicized at the time. So the Navy said, we want to be in business with this guy, and so he was the first guy recruited by the Office of Naval Research. They had a permanent chair in his name, so he would spend about 2/3 of his time on his just whatever musings amused him, like trying to figure out the ocean gyres and what connects all of these ocean currents and what drives them. I mean, they knew that there were these ocean currents and big he called gyres, which are all these streams connecting the oceans in the world, and he accurately assessed that it was actually the wind against tiny little ripples across the ocean, and these were in fact wind-driven gyres. And he was able to map this whole thing. This is before satellites and any of the sort of things they have now. Anyway, he did remarkable things, and he was a big contributor to the Navy. He was in the Jasons. He was the first Navy guy in the Jasons, and he came up with this. So his big contribution that touched on my story was that he, like many oceanographers, were interested in the idea of climate change and global warming. And interestingly enough, so was the Navy. The Navy was the first government agency to invest in studying this, because the polar ice cap had always been a critical battle space, particularly for submarines. And so if the polar ice cap was melting, they wanted to know about it first. And so, in any case, he came up with a very elegant sound experiment, which is simply to measure the speed at which sound travels in the ocean over a period of time. Because even though sound travels almost 5 times faster in the water than in air, it's constant unless there's temperature change. And you couldn't stick a thermometer, or you couldn't do that in a local place because every locality has different temperature and pressure. So you had to do it across the whole ocean. So he's the guy who came up with the idea of using low-frequency sound signals that you could broadcast across the whole ocean.
And that was his crowning achievement, at least in his own mind. He thought, but then he ran into obstacles from environmentalists, right?
He was a great physical oceanographer, but he had a blind spot. I mean, this is one of the things I learned. Even a genius can have a big blind spot, and his blind spot is he didn't think about, well, wait a minute, what's it going to do to the whales, or who's going to care about this? So that when people started objecting, because this was right after the end of the Cold War, and he was talking about this quite proudly, and the Navy wanted him talking about this because this was a shining example of a dual-use program, because it also had a very clear military application in terms of finding submarines.
And he picked an island. And he picked an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean,
right,
just south of the Indian subcontinent, because from that one spot you could send sound out to all 7 continents on Earth at the same time.
Right. The only place, and there's a great illustration in the book that he drew, essentially. It's a recreation of what he drew on that napkin in the Cosmos Club you were talking about.
Right.
And it's the only place in the whole world that you could draw direct ray paths to 7 continents.
Was he ever able to implement that program?
Well, that's a good question because he did do his proof of concept test, which was a success. He called it the shot heard all around the world because it was from Heard Island, and it did work. And he did run into opposition, specifically from NRDC, as soon as he tried to implement it. So the long story short is, it was killed essentially because NRDC negotiated a settlement where basically he'd have to spend the first part of his money studying the reaction of the sound on whales, and there was immediately a whale stranding under mysterious circumstances, and that stalled it. So that whole experiment got essentially 86th, but there have been other similar ones. They revived it under different names, so the concept is being explored elsewhere, and not so much for global warming, but the idea of being able to see in the ocean using a single sound source that goes across whole ocean things. So it's hard to say whether it's operating under a different name as the best. But what was interesting with Monk was he felt totally burned, and he was kind of burned because he was being called out as this eco-criminal, and people were saying terrible things about him in public, and all he wanted to do was verify global warming and measure it, which was a noble goal. But in fact, that's where the deaf whale is a dead whale, that war cry started up, and he went to public meeting after public meeting to defend his experiment, and got shouted down, and so he basically never talked to a journalist again after that. And so when I met, I was up at Woods Hole working with a guy named Admiral Dick Pittenger, who was a retired admiral, who turned out to be my best source. And I was saying to him, and he was explaining the rudiments of sonar to me on a whiteboard, and saying, okay, here's how you do it, and here's what we were doing, and he was very open and informative. And I said to him, my one frustration, I was several years in at this point, I said, this is great talking to you, and you've introduced me some other admirals, and thank you so much. The one person I just would love to meet someday is Walter Monk, but whenever I call over to Scripps, his assistants say he doesn't speak to journalists or writers anymore. And he said, "Oh, Walter's right down here. He's at the geophysics fluid cottage. He and I'll take you down and introduce him to you this afternoon." And I don't know if you've ever been to Woods Hole, but it's a little research town. It's like a little academic town, and I'd actually grown up spending summers near there, and I never knew about these little cabins up in the woods. But it's like a little Adirondack cabin. It couldn't be more rustic, right? This is just a little cabin with a blackboard and a desk and a chair and a little front deck. And we go there, and it says Geophysics Fluid Cottage, a little plaque on the outside. And inside is Walter Monk, who's this little pixie of a guy who's so totally charming, totally courtly, a heavy Viennese accent, but a real twinkle in his eye. I mean, has that childlike glee at his own clever ideas and other people's ideas.
He's in his 90s when you're interviewing him?
He was probably 90 when I first met him, and I had 2 other meetings. I had 3 meetings with him, and I think 93 the last time I met with him on this anniversary of the anniversary here in Washington. But I saw him out in Scripps at his home, because we had this wonderful, he really, for good reason, was really pissed off at journalists and how he'd been treated in the press. So, but, because I came in on the arm of Dick Pittenger and was introduced as this young writer who's, not young writer, because to him everybody's young, a writer who was serious about this topic and wanted to talk to him, and he was totally charming, and he said, "Oh, you should come visit me in my home in La Jolla when you're out there," and I was out there with my 13-year-old daughter and on a vacation, and I took her up there, and he was totally charming to her, and he had us to lunch, and he's just in addition to being a brilliant person who, as soon as he starts talking, you realize he's operating on a different plane, but a good explainer, but also just charming, and that was the thing. Everybody liked him, and he was this genius, and he still ran into problems with the environmentalists, but he was just a terrific. He did things like, they have the chronic problems in Venice with flooding, right? So they were constantly trying to figure out how to control the flooding in Venice because it's sinking and all that. So they invited him to come over there and study the tides there and come up with solutions. And in fact, he came up with a solution that's credited with, buying another 20 years for Venice, before it goes underwater. So
how did he get the data to predict the 12 or 16? I mean, he's the first surf forecaster. He could just think, he should be write articles for Surfer magazine because he could have predicted.
Oh no, he did. So he's been adopted by. What he had done is he had followed this. He had done this first thing where he had followed one wave all the way across the Pacific, not personally, but he had stationed research vessels at intervals and followed a wave all the way from the South Pacific to the California coast, and he was able to chart it for the first time and show where it goes and how it acts. And then he did something, and before that, though, when he was predicting the surf during the war, he was what he did what the only other scientist I found that did this was Leonardo da Vinci. If you've ever seen the Da Vinci Codex, it's actually, a lot of it's just studies of water, how water swirls in a whirlpool, how water droplets form, and exquisite drawings of water in action. And he was doing the same thing. He took a wave and he deconstructed it, and he came up with fetch, throw. I'm sorry, I can't recollect the three properties, but he basically broke a wave down into three properties and came up with some mathematical principles that guide waves. And so he was able to predict that if it started here at such a time, and here were the wind conditions and the meteorological conditions above water, what would the size of that wave be 8 days later as the same wave crashed on the shores? I mean, this kind of stuff.
Right.
So. Yeah, different ballpark than you and I operate in is all I can tell you.
Well, how did he get his data for the D-Day thing? Did he actually?
Well, he had access to meteorological data, which whatever was available.
Mm-hmm.
And see, what's so cool about him is he's the first guy who figured out. I mean, he figured out about 16 different things, right, in his career. He had a long career and kept moving from one topic to another. One of the things he figured out is that the storm systems, the meteorology that we can see and track in the air, storms basically moving through in pressure systems, are mirrored, not mirrored as in identically, but there are very parallel, analogous weather systems throughout the oceans. So there are storm tides and eddies. So he was able to figure out that it's not just the motion of the wave, but it's the weather patterns above and below the surface of the ocean. So he just had this holistic view of the world. First, all of the oceans being connected as one river, then the ocean and the ocean and the air being connected. And he just, he's one of these guys who I hope he lives forever, but he won't, and it's going to be a huge loss, someday.
Well, and he describes storms underwater even. As if,
storm eddies,
weather systems underwater.
Yep, absolutely. And that was of crucial importance to the Navy, because if you're working with sonar systems, particularly ones that go across whole ocean basins, it's not enough to say we've got to go from point A to B. How is this intervening storm, going to affect the sound signals?
Who are your favorite? And we could go, I'm sure, a whole other hour about Monk. Yeah. He's incredible, especially the whole. I'm a surfer, and I my first thought was, gee, he could have started Surfline, and he would have been the, instead of.
Well, the Surfrider Foundation has honored him because he basically is the guy who came up with storm prediction. He came up with the first tsunami warning system.
Amazing.
In the world. I mean, he just, so surfers have acknowledged his contribution.
Are you going to do a book on him?
Yeah.
Well, listen, who's your favorite Navy character? I know how many minutes we got left over here, D? 5. We got 5 or 10 minutes to go.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about some of these other characters. Jim Meade. I mean, when I go to Washington the next time, I want to go to the Smithsonian and just go to see.
Go find him, because he's retired, quote unquote, and he's emeritus now, but he's still at his office every day. Anytime I go down there, Jim is still there. He just isn't, running the administrative stuff anymore. He's just doing what he likes, which is research.
But what's your impression on the Navy and the way they handle this? Who are your favorite Navy characters in your book?
Here's what I learned, and again, I had the advantage or disadvantage, depending on your point of view, of starting with a total blank slate. There's nobody from the Navy, and my father was in the Air Force, but I never knew anyone in the Navy. And I learned a lot about the Navy, and one of the things I learned is that the Navy is not a monolithic institution like it's like any other. You can't speak in general about the Navy. The Navy is an amalgamation of individuals. Of course, it is a huge institution, and so, it changes with time, though it's a fairly conservative institution, and it changes slowly. So this was an issue that the Navy was behind the curve on, meaning they wanted to kind of keep it the way it was during the Cold War in terms of their being able to operate however they chose, wherever they chose, without having to be accountable to civilian authorities or federal regulatory agents or certainly environmental lawyers. So they, understandably, I mean, it's human nature who wants to change in that regard. But they were behind the curve so that they were reacting rather than taking the lead. And so the character who, I mean, is my favorite because he taught me so much and he was such, I think, a really fair-minded person, is this Admiral Pittenger. And this is the guy who, at the end of the Cold War, he was the director of anti-submarine warfare for the Navy in the Pentagon from 1987, 88 to 90. So he was he was the architect of this whole LFA, low-frequency active sonar program. So, he's about as deep inside the Navy as you could be in terms of this story, right? But he was somebody who, I'm trying to remember how I found my way to him. Well, he was at Woods Hole, so when he left the Navy, he first became the oceanographer of the Navy, which was still a Navy position, and then he went from that to working at Woods Hole, which is an oceanographic institute that has a lot of Navy money and a lot of ships, and he was kind of helping to run their fleet of research vessels. But the thing I learned is that retired Navy admirals are actually a key part, and I don't know how old your father was when he retired, but I would guess that he didn't go from being whatever rank admiral he was to just playing golf on all day. These guys tend to this was so Pittenger was a 2-star admiral who retired really at the peak of his powers in his 50s. And
same with my dad, and they stay involved forever. Yeah,
and they're called flag buddies, is how they refer to each other, and they're an important network. And it's not just informal. I mean, largely it's informal. They're they adjudicate in war games.
What happened?
I don't know. We're still here.
Okay, yeah, they're still there.
They work in. They look at they get involved in after action reports. They do all sorts of things, and they do a fair amount of politicking behind the scenes.
Now, Pittenger actually had commanded a battle group himself. I mean, he'd been a line officer. I saw,
Absolutely.
Right? And so
he had done it in the Mediterranean for years. He'd really honed the kind of sonar that really become kind of the culprit as we learned more. We being science, investigation. Revealed that it really wasn't so much low-frequency active sonar as what's called mid-frequency sonar, which is what's mounted on almost every warship in the fleet. And that's the one that was the problem in the Bahamas and has been the problem up until including recently. So he was the one who was kind of really perfecting the art of sonar warfare, if you will, or anti-submarine warfare using sonar in the Mediterranean, but in particular up into the Black Sea. He was very active in the 70s and 80s, on the surface ships, and so he was very invested, and remains very, very, very invested in readiness. Anti-submarine warfare readiness is his byword, and he spent the Cold War worrying about some submarine leaking through the acoustic net of SOSUS, and then after that worried about how they were going to find these submarines, and that's why he helped create low-frequency active sonar. And so, advocate for the Navy side in terms of we need to be ready. Yes, the Russians are no longer a threat, but now we have all these rogue nations. All you need is one submarine. Look what a Kodiak. Look what an inflatable boat packed with explosives did to the USS Cole. Imagine what one submarine could do to an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf. So he's totally unapologetic about the Navy mission. Having said that,
for good reason.
For good reasons, and he's very lucid and clear and persuasive in that regard, and I would never challenge that or him on that grounds. On the other hand, he also recognizes that the Navy is a kind of conservative institution that needs to get this right, and that he was pulling his hair out watching the Navy go to court over and over again and lose in court against NRDC, which is what happened for the first several cases. And he was saying, listen, every time we lose a court case, we lose our moral high ground. We lose ground. We should find someone, and he thought Joel Reynolds was a perfectly reasonable person to do it with, somebody we can sit down with and come up with a workable modus vivendi here. So we can do what we need to do, and they can do what they need to do, which is, deal with their priorities in terms of marine conservation, and let's get it done so that we can operate. Because every time we get an injunction imposed by a judge, we can't operate, and that impacts us. So he was very pragmatic, and he was loyal and pro-Navy, but not blindly so. And he never villainized the environmentalists. He's saying, listen, this is part of the world we operate in. Let's just be clear-eyed about it and get it done, and stop polarizing this and ending up in court. So and he also did me the great favor of introducing me not only to Walter Monk, but to several admirals who, with his introduction, I was able to interview at great length. And I just think he's the best example I met of the kind of Navy officers who don't allow these sort of false dichotomies of conservation versus national security really take hold. I think he realizes it's a big enough ocean for everybody.
In the last couple of minutes, we've only just got about 3 minutes left, Josh, but I just saw last week offshore drilling has become the latest thing. What is and you've obviously where is what kind of does that sonar or whatever it is that they're using, is that the same sort of thing, and does that pose a threat to marine mammals, and where
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up, because as much as my book focuses on military sonar, and there are also civilian applications as a source of sound pollution in the ocean, the larger issue is really the whole spectrum of noise pollution in the ocean, the worst being international shipping, which is just a constant drone that masks, a tremendous amount of what's called acoustic smog in the ocean is from that. And then there's oil and gas drilling, exploration and drilling. And this is all over the world now, and the problem is that they use to find oil deposits, which is what the Obama administration just green-lit from the Delaware Bay all the way down to Orlando, I think.
Yeah, off our coast, which
and this is a coast, and we've been shielded from this story. This is something California and the Gulf Coast and Alaskans have been dealing with for decades, and we've been protected from this. But I'm telling you, it's coming home to roost, and what it means is they're going to have these air guns, which are the loudest industrial noise in the ocean, and they're called guns because that's what they are. They're firing these compressed air volleys at tremendous decibel and intensity from the surface straight down to the floor of the ocean to try to get an echo off the floor, which will show them where there might be gas or oil deposits. And that's how they've done it. And the problem is that they go back and forth in this kind of grid pattern, just continuously firing every 6 seconds. It's not one gun; it's a whole chain of these guns.
So is NRDC and Joel Reynolds? I mean, don't they have to go through this same permitting process? And don't they?
Yeah. Well, yes. The difference is they did, and they got permits from the Bureau of Energy and Minerals and Energy, BOEM. Bureau of Energy and Minerals, I believe, which is inside the Interior Department, which granted them these permits. So I can promise you, I don't know if it's going to be NRDC or another group, but somebody is very soon going to be challenging these in court because, this is in the migratory path, for instance, of the North Atlantic right whale, which is the most endangered species of whale in the world. There are only 500 of them left in the world, and they migrate right along the coast, all the way up and down the coast. And, previously the problem was ship strikes, but they've really solved that problem largely, so that's been great. So they've grown from 300 to 500. But if you start setting off these endless volleys of air guns in their migratory path, these animals are not going to survive, and there are sea turtles and other endangered marine mammals and marine life along this coastline that you know about and I know about, and they're not going to survive this. I mean, they're going to at the very least abandon their foraging and migration paths, and that's bad for an endangered species, I can tell you.
Well, we're going to have to wrap it right there, but I'm going to make a last comment. I think you'll agree that if it does go to court, they won't have the national security exemption for them this time on the oil and gas people.
They will not have a national security, but the problem with taking on the oil companies is they have literally bottomless pockets, and they have as many lawyers as they want to hire to fight it on as many fronts. And the fact is, they're much tougher target to take to court in some ways, but we'll see.
And the Supreme Court has shown a willingness to side with corporate interests recently, so we'll
see where that goes. You're probably know more about the legal angle than I do in terms of this area, but it's definitely going to end up in the courts for better or for worse.
We have spent the last 2 hours with Joshua Horwitz, his book, War of the Whales. Thank you so much, Josh, for spending your time with us today. It's been great.
It's been really a treat for me, too. I've really enjoyed being able to discuss it, this kind of depth and sophistication with you. You're a great interview.
Okay, thanks a lot, and we'll see you back here next week on Justice for All. This is George Yates. Have a great day.